Good morning, everybody. Could I ask you to take your seats? Senior Minister of State Heng, Excellencies, friends, to all of you in the room and to those of you joining this morning online, welcome to the public portion of the 11th IISS Shangri-La Dialogue Sherpa meeting and our keynote address to be delivered by Senior Minister of State for Defence of Singapore, Heng Chee How. My name is James Crabtree. I'm the Executive Director of the IISS Asia. On behalf of our Director General and Chief Executive, John Chipman, our Chair of Trustees, Bill Emmett, who joins us here today, and our partners and friends at the Singapore Ministry of Defence, welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us. The annual Shangri-La Dialogue Sherpa meeting brings together 100 or so senior defense officials, military officers, representatives of international organizations and experts to discuss the most pressing issues of regional security. It also helps to prepare the agenda for the full Shangri-La Dialogue meeting, which this year takes place from June 2nd to 4th. Our Sherpa allows our delegates to have private, off-record discussions about pressing issues of common concern and private meetings with one another, but it also, by tradition, kicks off with an on-record address to inform the public conversation in the region about the challenges that we face and the potential solutions that might be provided for them. Before we begin, some very brief housekeeping this morning. Our lecture program, keynote address this morning will run for about 45 minutes. Shortly, Senior Minister of State Heng will deliver the keynote address for about 20 minutes. There will then be a period of time for points from the floor and questions for the Senior Minister, and we will wrap up precisely at 9:15. I would be very grateful for those of you in the room if you might turn your phones off or turn them to silent so that there's no introduction or interruption to the Senior Minister's remarks. I think it goes without saying that this is a challenging and dynamic time in our region as Southeast Asia and the Asia-Pacific region more generally copes with the after effect of the COVID pandemic, rising great power competition, and the challenge of particular flashpoints from the Himalayas to Myanmar to the South China Sea to the Taiwan Strait. It's also a dynamic moment in which new forces are shaping the future of the region, from rising powers themselves to new minilateral institutions like the Quad or AUKUS. Singapore's Prime Minister Lee put it this way in his National Day address last year: "Around us, a storm is gathering," he said. US-China relations are worsening, with intractable issues, deep suspicions, and limited engagement between them. This is unlikely to improve anytime soon. Furthermore, miscalculations or mishaps can easily make things worse." End quote. So the question before us is, how should Singapore and Southeast Asia respond as a region to these challenges? And indeed, what does the traditional concept of regionalism mean in this new era? And it is on this topic that Senior Minister of State Heng will address us this morning. He has entitled his address, "Enhancing Regionalism in a Turbulent World." So on behalf of all of us at the IISS and all of our Sherpa meeting delegates gathered here at the Shangri-La Hotel in Singapore this morning, welcome once again, and can I invite you, Senior Minister of State, to deliver your keynote address to the 11th IISS Shangri-La Dialogue Sherpa meeting. Thank you very much.
First, with a bit of technology, so I could read the script properly. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Shangri-La Dialogue Sherpa meeting 2023. The last time I addressed the Sherpa meeting was back in 2020, just before COVID came big time into Singapore and indeed the world. So I think all of us are very, very glad, I'm sure, to be able to meet again like this in such numbers. And I think also it gives us great pleasure to be able to set a record for something positive as we meet again like this. This morning as we met, Mr. Crabtree told me that he has been reliably informed by the staff here at the Shangri-La Dialogue that all of us here, all of you here, are record-setting. In that the Shangri-La has told him that this square table or rectangular table is the biggest one that they've ever set. So congratulations on being record-breaking already. But I would say that really looking back at the year 2020, much has changed. While we hope that the worst of the pandemic can be behind us, and that hasn't really yet happened, different parts of the world are at different stages of trying to come out of it. But I think more and more different countries would have a better grip of it. And eventually, hopefully, that we can then go into a really, really post-pandemic world. We are along that process. But even as we are making progress as individual countries, as the world, along that journey, I think we can all also agree that new geopolitical challenges have come to the fore. And we are indeed, as Mr. Crabtree said, living in turbulent times, and we are facing heightened threats to peace and stability. So this year's Sherpa meeting, plenary session topics, indeed speak to pertinent security trends which will concern all of us. And these include maintaining the equilibrium in the Asia-Pacific, especially amid US-China tensions, military modernization and its impact on the region's strategic balance, nuclear threats and capabilities, and lastly, but not the least, defense cooperation frameworks for regional security. So later on, as I share some perspectives on regionalism, it is in this context of how, especially for those of us operating in this region, that we should pay attention also to the importance of getting regional networks, regional cooperation in place and working properly as part and parcel and a significant contribution to the overall world order that we hope would be one that would be stable and that would serve the purposes of all. And so I wish that the discussions that you'll be having here today and in this Sherpa meeting will lay a firm foundation and strong groundwork for a very fruitful Shangri-La dialogue to be held later this year. So this morning, allow me to share some reflections on regionalism in the turbulent world. I hope that this can be useful to the meeting's discussions on how to sustain equilibrium. Now, the concept of regionalism is, of course, not new. Different ways of looking at it, and one is to understand it as a socio-cultural construct that connects people across spaces. So there's an affinity, says that we can see ourselves instinctively as part of a region, and therefore there are things that we ought to be able to do in concert. A different way, or another way to see that set of connections would be to take an economic lens to it and to see it as an economic network of interdependent trading centers. Whatever the case, in many instances, then regionalism would manifest itself as regional organizations. And you can see that as in the case of the EU, as in the case of APEC and ASEAN. So fundamental to the concept of regionalism is the idea that the peoples of a particular geography share and feel a common putative sense of affinity and affiliation. One important form of regionalism in the pre-colonial era in Southeast Asia was the patchwork of maritime trade links that was built up, evolved within the region. And they connected the region to other parts of Asia, to the Middle East, and to Europe. And through this network of connections flowed goods, technologies, and cultural and religious influences, both ways, as between Southeast Asia and the other parts of the world. And this fostered interconnectedness within the region and beyond, bringing people closer together in very practical areas like trade, but also more than that in social, cultural dimensions as well. This bringing of peoples together and the interests together, this interconnectedness, and notwithstanding this interconnectedness, that brought about greater wealth, more trade, and relative open exchanges of ideas and culture. That did not necessarily mean that it also ensured peace. It wasn't. And so if you look at the history of pre-colonial Southeast Asia, I think there are also very clear periods of conflict and war. As you saw, as in the works, in the acts of the great regional powers of the time, Angkor, in Ayutthaya, Funan, Majapahit are the kingdoms and empires of the region. They frequently disputed and fought over resources, cultural differences, control over maritime trade routes. Fast forward a little bit, and as we entered the era of the Western colonial rule, as the powers from Europe came and established colonies, that also artificially altered how Southeast Asia interacted with and related to itself. Basically, it was carved out. And for most of that period, the constituent parts were politically and economically tied more tightly to their colonial metropoles in distant shores, depending on which colonial power there are colonies of. So that changed. The map, the geographical map remained the same, but the interactions changed. And then you move forward to the Second World War, where the Japanese tried to establish the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which it said was aimed at creating a self-sufficient bloc of Asian peoples and states for co-prosperity under Japanese rule. Fast forward a little bit more, and now we have entered the post-World War II period. And from the 1950s to the 1970s, we saw the establishment of other regional organizations post-war, and this time trying to get the different parts emerging out of the war to work more closely together. So you see the establishments of organizations such as SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which was set up to stem the tide of communism at the time, the Association of Southeast Asia, which was founded by Malaya, Philippines, and Thailand, and Mafilindo to promote cooperation among the countries of the Philippines, Malaya, and Indonesia. So, as you can expect, the geopolitics of the time interacted with security and other challenges, trade possibilities and challenges, and so the different countries acting in their own national interests and also looking at the need to maintain a certain stability within the region in order to facilitate what would be in their national interests, cooperated together and tried to, but not always successfully and not always sustainably. And so the examples that I've just mentioned, they were not long-lived. They were fairly short-lived, and they were pulled apart as the Cold War set in, and they were also divided by mutual differences. Then, in 1967, while the Cold War and Vietnam War was still continuing apace, ASEAN was born with 5 countries: Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Singapore. And by the turn of the century, the membership of ASEAN had grown from 5 to 10, and it also had set up various accompanying ASEAN-centered regional institutions, such as the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, the ASEAN Regional Forum. And as I trace the history of the region, not doing justice, obviously, in a couple of minutes to trace such a long period, but you can then see that the fact that ASEAN had, over the past 50 years or so, brought the countries of Southeast Asia together in a more formalized manner to cooperate together for mutual benefit, for regional stability as a contribution to the conditions of progress for this region and beyond, was not something that had a very stable genealogy. You can't just look back and say that it has always been like that. It goes without saying, far from it. And it is for this reason that I've devoted this first part of my speech to tracing this, just to underscore the fact that effective regionalism is not preordained, yet it is possible. And I think a more relevant one, it is the related fact that there is much to be gained by all the stakeholders by putting in the effort and the will to make good, effective regionalism work. Not as an aim in itself necessarily, but certainly seeing it as a very important piece that can produce benefits from the participants, for the region that they participate in, and as a contribution to the overall global order. But as we do so, I think, and consider what might be the challenges that we will now have to face in the modern era as we continue to put in that effort and to master the will collectively to make regionalism a positive contribution. Here we think that there are three areas that we should look out for carefully. First, we think that our normative sense of affinity and connection, whether here in the Southeast Asia or the wider Asia-Pacific region or beyond, I think it's something that we can all agree in this room, is increasingly buffeted by great power rivalry, by protectionism and militarization. So the net result of all that is that the risk of conflict, or the risk of misunderstanding, of rubbing each other the wrong way, leading to conflict, those risks have increased. Second, the international rules-based order is under stress. And I would say that you cannot see an even clearer example of that than to see the violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of one state by another. That is the starkest of examples. So without regard or respect for international law, rules and norms, then the survival and security, peace and progress of states big and small, and the functioning of regional organizations to which they belong would certainly be undermined. Third, you can see countries are increasing their respective military spending. I'm told that world military expenditure crossed the US 2 trillion mark for the first time last year, 2021. And in the last decade, from 2011 to 2021, defense spending increased by 28.8% within Southeast Asia and 55.5% within Asia. So you can see the build-up. And I think there is a certain dynamic to that as well, as people look at the overall situation and they look at what each other is doing. And sometimes you can build a certain dynamic to it, and we are seeing the results of that. And as you build that one up, and then you can also quite commonsensically imagine the impact of that on psychology, on options, on what might be possible on the negative side if things go wrong. And at the same time, we're also seeing a more congested region as powers from beyond this region shift attention to the Asia-Pacific. And for some, also as a consequence of their deliberate Indo-Pacific strategies. So as we continue to welcome the participation of all parties who can contribute to upholding the freedom and openness of this region, we must at the same time guard against anything that would inadvertently raise the temperature through actions intended or otherwise that would then increase the risk of miscalculation and accidents that would then escalate things. And so in the face of all these challenges, I think that our best option remains to improve and to adapt various mechanisms, global, multilateral, and certainly regionally, through effective regionalism to serve the needs of our time. And again, the needs of our time in the context that we meet would be how to preserve and enhance the sense of stability so that we can have peace and development, which serves the needs of all our peoples. And to do this, we would like to offer here 3 suggestions for the delegates' consideration. First, revitalizing our collective commitment to build a cohesive region within ASEAN and the Asia-Pacific via the array of existing regional institutions. So building a cohesive region does not mean to say that there would not be differences, but yet to achieve this objective and produce the net gains for everyone, we would need to have states exercise self-restraint and not allow disputes or competition to thoroughly divide us, but instead to be able to channel differences through the institutions in order to find peaceful solutions and to establish areas of cooperation where these might be possible. And within ASEAN, it is imperative for members to consider the collective interests of the region, even as each of us pursue our legitimate national interests. Second, sub-regional groupings within Southeast Asia can be used to address more targeted issues that may not require the attention of all ASEAN countries. For instance, existing institutions will need to work together with complementary sub-regional groupings to tackle more specific issues. The Malacca Straits Patrol, for example, is an effective sub-regional grouping consisting of the littoral states of Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand. And another example within the maritime domain is a trilateral cooperative agreement between Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Together, the sub-regional grouping conducts maritime air patrols to address transnational crimes in the Sulu Sea. Such groupings allow for swifter responses to sub-regional issues, but as they do so, they also benefit the wider region in the contribution to overall security. Third, regional organizations and institutions must be prepared to adapt their internal mechanisms and to adjust to new external realities. And those changing realities would include that of increasing attention and deployment by powers beyond this region into the region. So you can see the actions by minilaterals like Quad, like AUKUS, and others, and as they pay more attention and express their interest through active deployments. And as they do so, I think as a region, we must take note of their presence. And we must find ways, as a region, with its regional setup, to encourage them to take on a positive agenda, and as they conduct their work and pursue their objectives, to also work constructively with regional countries. And such efforts well done together will go a long way in providing reassurance, preventing misunderstanding, and then be able to positively contribute to the security of the region. So, ladies and gentlemen, in a tumultuous world, we would argue that amongst the many things that we need to do, effective regionalism can be a bulwark and a stabilizing force. And the Asia-Pacific region will be a key focus of geopolitics. And we must think ahead and work together to secure peace and stability for the good of all. And on this note, I wish everyone here a very fruitful set of deliberations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senior Minister of State. If you would retake your seat, you've given us a thoughtful account of the history and present predicament of regionalism. You've noted rising risks, including great power competition, militarism, and what you described as the violation of territorial integrity, and also the trends of rising regional military spending, both within Southeast Asia and more generally. You warned against actions that raised the temperature in the region, but also provided a number of constructive ways forward, including sub-regional initiatives, but also embracing the new trend for minilateral organizations and trying to, in a sense, see that as a new reality that the region has to work with. I'll now open the floor. I'll begin with one question of my own before I look for questions from the floor. Those of you who would like to make questions, I would ask you to keep the questions brief and to make only one question as opposed to a number of questions. But Senior Minister of State, I wonder, the context of regionalism, as you said, is shaped by rising great power competition, particularly between the United States and China. I wonder if you might address for the audience a little further what behaviors you would like to see from those two countries as we move beyond the incidents at the end of last year and hope for a moment of greater cooperation between the United States and China, as for instance we saw during the meeting of their respective defense secretaries at the Shangri-La dialogue here in Singapore last year. So I wonder if you could address that before we open up for questions from the floor. And just before you do that, if anybody wants to ask a question, if you want to turn your name tag right ways up, and then I can see who'd like to ask a question. Senior Minister of State.
Thank you very much. I think the relationship between China and the US is the most important one in the world, from whichever angle you look at it, from trade, from exchange of ideas, for technology, for security. And I think we can understand why there is this competition. The US has, since the Second World War, been a primary power in the world. And by now, China is the second biggest economy in the world. And technologically has made great progress in the decades, more recent decades especially. So I think we can understand the sense of, the real sense of competition amongst these two. Each one great in its own way, proud history, and wanting to have its place in the world order. And how that then happens become very important, not only for these two countries and the peoples of these two countries, but for the rest of us. So if you were to say, and I think this would not come as a surprise to anyone in this room, that everyone would want to see that this competition not lead to conflict and confrontation, even as we recognize that the competition is natural, to be expected and unavoidable. And how do you actually find ways to conduct it in a way that would not upend and destabilize security and peace within the region and internationally. The meetings between the two presidents in Indonesia, I think, gave hope that there would be more discourse between the countries, and as they seek ways in which to relate to one another in trade, in security, and so on, and find ways in which they can have space and at the same time to be able to assert their influence, but at the same time not have it unravel into open conflict. For countries in the region, I think one thing that everybody wants to avoid or hope not to be pushed into is to take sides. Because if you go back into a world where you divide into this side and that side, essentially you can't do better than if you have a world in which you could work together. And there will be much more downsides than upsides for everybody. So that is the wish. Now, how do you then make that happen? And I think ultimately we will then come back into the importance of communications. At least then you would enhance understanding. You would be able to put forth positions and achieve a greater level of clarity before you make assumptions and then you take certain actions which may be rightly or wrongly understood, and then it leads to a certain negative dynamic. So it's in that sense that I think forums like this, and as we also discuss here and prepare for forums like Shangri-La Dialogue, that we really want to put communications at a platform where people can meet and be frank with each other, with the aim, actually, the frankness is with the aim of achieving mutual understanding, lowering temperatures, preventing mishaps, miscalculations. It is those kinds of things. And then beyond that, beyond the not getting into direct conflict, to look for opportunities to still work together. And I think those two things to continue apace. And the more I think we can do that, I think we can collectively shepherd this world in a region that is, in an era that would be more, I would say, relatively more stable.
Thank you. I'm going to take 3 or 4 questions from the floor in the order that I saw them go up. So I'll start with Evan Laxmana from Indonesia.
Good morning. Sorry. Thank you, Minister, for the speech. I'm Evan Laxmana. I'm a senior fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. My question is this. Where do we find the balance between pushing for inclusive regionalism, which has been a centerpiece of how ASEAN does business over the last few decades, on the one hand, and the concern about strategic overcrowding at the end? What you mentioned in the speech as a congested region, where if we see a strategic overcrowding in where extra-regional powers overlay or override a regional agenda set by ASEAN, that's certainly not something that should be warmly embraced. So where do we find the balance between inclusive regionalism, where everyone is welcome to be part of the regional security architecture, and preventing a strategic overcrowding on the other? Thank you. Thank you,
Evan. Next, I'd like to turn to Bích Tran from Vietnam.
Thanks, James. My name is Bích Tran, a visiting fellow at IISS Institute. Senior Minister, would you please share with us your understanding of ASEAN's centrality and whether how emerging multilateral groupings such as the Quad or AUKUS either compete or complement existing ASEAN-led mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you, Beck. I'd now like to turn to Senior Colonel Lee from China.
Thank you so much, Mr. Senior Minister. I'm Lee from China Foundation for International Strategic Studies. And my question is, I think the globalization is still the main trend. And would you please shed a little more light on the relationship between the globalization and the regionalization? Is there a concern if we overstress the regionalization, that will be the impact, or positive or negative impact on the globalization? Thank you so much.
And finally, I'd like to call on Ewan Graham from the IISS.
Thank you, SMS Heng. Apologies, I can't look you in the eye when I ask the question, just because of the angle from which I'm placed. Evan Laxman has already asked my question, so I will just develop it slightly in specifics. The tension between inclusivity on one hand and efficiency on the other seems to me a feature of regionalism. That's recently played out in an interesting way with ASEAN's decision to open the door to full membership for Timor-Leste in future. So I'd just be interested if you could develop how in that specific case, what were the principles around inclusivity versus efficiency? Because Timor-Leste has been knocking on the door for some time and has met with something of a mixed reception. What has changed now to create the conditions for membership?
Very good. So, Senior Minister of State, two questions broadly on the point of strategic overcrowding and outside actors, minilateralism, and then Senior Colonel Lee's point about the global and regional.
Thank you. Trying to see how best to arrange it. If you would allow me, I will begin by answering question number 3, because I think that sets the stage for me to address the other 3 questions in a logical way. So we speak of globalization. And why is it that globalization actually took center stage in the world for many years? And it was welcomed by many countries in the world. And the reason for that was because if done correctly, it can actually produce good results and better results for the stakeholder countries and the peoples of those countries. If you look at it from the perspective of the production of goods, the production of services, and the economics of those, and how that could then improve the accessibility, improve the wealth creation, improve the resource creation for the countries of the world, in which they can reinvest into the progress of the country for the good of the peoples. So there was a reason why globalization as a concept was welcome, and as it operated, it expanded, because countries, companies, peoples could see the advantage of it. And even in the era in which we saw globalization take center stage and was very much welcome, it was not everything global all the time. But at the same time, you also had regional, sometimes even bilateral arrangements coexist with a global arrangement. If you look at trade, for example, you could have the WTO agreements, but at the same time, you could also have regional trade agreements and even bilateral trade agreements. I think one can then say that the risk is that how to do it in such a way that sub-global arrangements do not inadvertently lock themselves in and do not then contribute, or in fact work to undermine and to bog down the progress towards global achievement for the global benefit. And that is the challenge. So it is in the implementation. And from there, I want to then lead on to this question of ASEAN centrality. And as I alluded to in my speech, the fact that ASEAN has been around for a good 5 decades, evolving from 5 to 10, now looking at adding, it was not without its challenges, and it wasn't smooth every step of the way either, not even now. But if it is done in a manner and under a set of considerations that, by and large, across issues, would enable solutioning, enable consensus, enable communications and discourse, then it can produce value in itself as a stabilizer, as a way in which that region can connect to the rest of the world, that the rest of the world can look at that and make sense of the region and so on. So I think that speaks to the centrality. So I think that in a global system, when you have positive, effective regional organizations that is doing its work, then that can actually not only serve the good of that region itself, but acting in concert with other effective, positive regions, regional organizations, and within the global order, then it can actually add to overall peace and stability. But at the same time, and again going back to the point about globalization, is that when you produce more wealth, when you produce more trade, indeed the level of activities goes up. So again, taking the trade example, if you look at the seas in Southeast Asia, the more trade there is, the more physically crowded they would be, for example. So congestion, so to speak, or the presence of more and more physical assets in and of themselves is not necessarily a problem, I mean, other than that of a traffic accident. But it is the rules under which they come together. That one is important. And when you have a set of rules that everybody who is participating in it, it's like the highway code, if one were to drive. And if everybody recognized that that is the code of conduct that we would all learn and we'll all abide by when we take to the roads, then the chances of mishaps and accidents will be reduced. So I think the question of how that is then to be achieved within the Southeast Asian region, first of all, I think then I bring back the point about ASEAN centrality. ASEAN has been around here for a good time now. We are the countries of this region. We understand this region arguably better. And we welcome participation of stakeholders that would ensure the freedom and the rules-based order within this region, so that everybody can prosper and everybody understands what is it that one needs to do in order to participate fully with one another and for mutual benefit. So once you can do that, I think it creates a platform in which friends from elsewhere, where they want to come here to with a positive agenda, as I alluded in my speech, and add to this peace and stability, and then we can then go by the same rules. I think that would help. So that is a, in principle, type of sort of framing of how we can all co-participate to make an active region dynamic yet peaceful.
Thank you, Senior Minister of State. With apologies to those around the room who I see who have their boards up, that draws to a close the time we have available for questions in the opening session. For those of you watching online, that also draws our public proceedings to a close, so thank you very much for joining us. For those in the room, you're now invited to join us for the opening reception of the Sherpa meeting in honor of Senior Minister of State Heng. I would invite you to stay in your seats until the Senior Minister has left the stage. The next session will start at 9:45 prompt, and so I would ask you to be back in your seats a few minutes prior to that. But I would also ask all of those of you gathered in the room to show our appreciation for a genuinely thoughtful keynote address at the 11th Shangri-La Dialogue Sherpa meeting from Senior Minister of State Heng. Thank you very much for your remarks this morning.
Thank you. Pleasure.